Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Wood. I am the Special Projects Manager for Early Music America. And we want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for our next interest session, which is Black and Brown composers in Baroque Latin America. And we're very thankful for everyone who has signed up as a record attendance for today. And we're excited to share this content with you. A couple of things ahead of the session. If you haven't participated or you need a reminder as to how to contribute during this time, you can use the, well, I'm getting a double back here. You can use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we will take those as we can throughout the session. There will be opportunities throughout the session to take a pause and answer some of those, and we'll also save time toward the end of the session to be able to answer some of your questions. If you have technical questions throughout the event and you're joining us via Zoom, you can send me a chat message using the chat feature, and you can also use the raise hand feature when and if that becomes part of the conversation for a variety of reasons. We want to draw your attention to the Early Music America website, earlymusicamerica.org, where you can find out more about our programming, other interest sessions and webinars, of which we have several that are upcoming in the next few weeks. You can also find out how to join and donate, and all of those proceeds from your donations and of memberships help to provide content like this and the other resources that Early Music America provides to the early music community. We'd also like to thank everyone who donated to the EMA and Gotham Early Music Scene Relief Fund. More than $100,000 have been raised since March, and we want to thank you all for that. We have helped hundreds of early musicians in need during the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you very much for contributing if you had the opportunity to do so. You can find out more about us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, and all of the information is there. You can also find links to those various platforms on our website if you missed those. You can sign up for our newsletter by texting early music to 42828, or you can use the sign up button at the bottom of earlymusicamerica.org. So once again, thank you all for joining us. I'd like to introduce the host and moderator for today, Maria Romero, who is a faculty member at Vanderbilt University. And she's also a member of the IDEA Task Force. That's the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Task Force that EMA began last fall. And Maria is going to be taking us through this presentation and helping to facilitate the questions as they come about during the process. And we're very thankful that Maria was able to join us this afternoon. And Maria, I'm going to invite you to introduce our presenter for today.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Early Music America, for having me host this fantastic panel. This is a topic that we are all hungry to learn about. So we're very grateful to Henry for sharing his knowledge with us. It is my honor to introduce him. Hailed by the Miami Herald for his superb continuo, brilliantly improvised and ornamented, Henry Lebedinsky has performed on historical keyboards with the Seattle Symphony, Seattle Opera, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, the Charlotte Symphony, Seraphic Fire, Sonoma Bach, and the Cantata Collective, among others. Recent conducting engagements include the Seattle Baroque Orchestra and Sonoma Bach's Live Oak Baroque Orchestra. He's the co-artistic director of Seattle's Pacific Music Works and the founder and director of PMW's Underground Concert Series, dedicated to educating and entertaining new audiences about the world of Baroque and classical music in unconventional, fun, and boozy venues. Mr. Lebedinsky is also the co-director of the San Francisco Bay Area-based Agave Baroque, with which he has recently released 2 albums with countertenor Reginald L. Mobley on the Vigo Recordings label. He and Mr. Mobley have spent the past decade introducing listeners near and far to music by Black composers from the past 250 years, including recent appearances at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris and Festival Printemps Musical des Allices in Morocco. Mr. Lebedinsky has lectured and led masterclasses on 17th and 18th century repertoire and performance practice at the University of Edinburgh's Dashkova Center for Russian Studies, Bowdoin College, and the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, among others, and is a former music critic for Fanfare magazine. An active composer and poet, his sacred music for choir and organ is published by Paraclete Press, Carus Verlag, Stuttgart, and Cantica Nova. A church musician for the past 26 years, he currently serves as organist and choir master at Seattle's historic Christ Episcopal Church and sits on the Committee for Liturgy and Music for the Episcopal Diocese of Olympia. Henry will elaborate more on this, but he has designed his panel in a way that we welcome questions throughout, so there will be room for discussion during the session as well as at the end of the panel. But this is such an extensive topic that Henry would like to invite those of you who are available and interested to stay for a separate meeting that will be a roundtable conversation of about 40 minutes. And we will share that link on the chat box soon and at the end of the session, so that if there are any questions that go unanswered, we can address them face-to-face during the roundtable. So without further ado, welcome Henry.
Thanks, Maria. All of you out there in virtual land, thanks for being part of this. I'm glad that the attendance is good, because this is such a topic that requires a lot more than 1 hour of time. And this is in some ways just a tickle. This is a beginning of a conversation that some of us have been having for years about how to expand not only the world of what we call early music, but how to bring it together in ways that we can use to really highlight the intersections of music history and colonialism and our current discussions on race that have been really long overdue. So what I'd like to do is break this conversation up into a couple of sections, and we can have some brief time for questions in between the sections. But ultimately, the reason I'm so interested in having the roundtable is because I hate to be sitting here and mansplaining to you something that I think we all can contribute our knowledge and questions to such an important topic. So one thing just to mention before we get started, I'd like to just shout out the Early Music America Artists Relief Fund. This is such a big deal in this period where I think so many of us have been affected by COVID. I'm not only a strong supporter of such a fund, I'm also a recipient. So thank you, Early Music America, for supporting those of us that are in need. Let's start with the idea of race and identity in colonial Latin America. Colonialism is a topic that we don't have the time or the breadth to address in the detail that it deserves right now. But the idea of countries looking at the rest of the world and saying, let's take what they have, let's take their mineral resources and enslave their peoples and get rich off other people. This has been something that is unfortunately a legacy of Western civilization that we need to really come to terms with on a greater level than even we've been able to right now. And colonialism, white supremacy, really can never be unentangled. On the other hand, the complexity of colonialism is that it has left a legacy of very multicultural societies, not just societies. In fact, very unjust societies, but multicultural nonetheless. And these are very much the types of situations that we are going to be facing in dealing with some of the composers that we are talking about today. Music was part of the carrot and stick method of colonialism. It was one of the biggest carrots. People using music not only in the religious context to civilize and save the souls of the indigenous peoples of the countries that they were encountering, but also as a way to, on the positive side, build community, build education and culture where they went, even when their ideas on culture were certainly not just or equitable. But that being said, music was one of the most powerful evangelism tools that the Spaniards, the Portuguese, used in the New World. And the elements of those evangelism tools, that is what we're going to be dealing with today. A lot of the music, the overwhelming amount of music that we are going to be discussing today is sacred music and comes from the Catholic Church, especially the Jesuits, but also just the larger Catholic institutions coming into these countries and building not only the missions that have been celebrated in popular culture, but also great cathedrals, lots of churches in communities that frankly got very wealthy and very large due to the natural resources of the countries in which they were being built. In South America, such cities as Potosí in Bolivia, and Mexico City, Oaxaca, Puebla in Mexico, Lima in Peru. These were very large centers of population. And not only did they incorporate native people and Spanish and Portuguese immigrants, but also a large number of Africans who were brought over against their will as slaves to work in the mines and also in the sugarcane and other agricultural plantations of South America. By the turn of the 18th century, there were over 100,000 people of African descent and African immigrants coming in from Angola, from Guinea, brought over as slaves, sometimes being kept in slavery, sometimes being freed. It was a very, very messy and diverse situation happening with African people going on in South America. And it really varied from country to country. Cities like Buenos Aires had very large African populations. Other cities did not. And it was really, really inclement on the industries and the cultures that were being built up in these different areas of the continent as to the relationship with African people and how that evolved as the countries grew and lurched toward independence in the 19th century. One of the real issues that we have to address moving forward is in these multicultural and fundamentally unjust societies, the images of the other, whether it is Indians, indigenous people, Africans, and the inevitable mestizos, the mixed race populations that grew in these centers of population. The music was reflective not only of these very multicultural civilizations, but also brought with it a great deal of baggage from Spain. A lot of the musical forms that we are going to deal with today did not originate in the New World. They originated in the Old World, in Spain and in Portugal. And the forms, the racial identities that were perpetuated in this music were already firmly established in Spain. Spain that used to be one of the most diverse and multicultural societies in all of Europe at the beginning of the 16th century, things changed dramatically. This was after the Inquisition, after a society that decided that, well, maybe we were just a little too tolerant of all of this multicultural, not only immigration, but also influence on the Spanish culture. Spain went and lurched in the other direction. And what you have during the 16th century, what we like to think of as the golden age of Spanish polyphony, was also the golden age of Spain first, the golden age of trying to create a Spanish national identity that unfortunately went in the other direction and really tried to counter some of the really strong African, Jewish, Muslim influences that were coming in to Spain before the expulsion in 1492 and the resulting kind of reactionary push towards a more nationalist Spanish culture. And from this national Spanish culture grew a really strong Spanish unique musical tradition. And unfortunately, we can't really understand what's happening in Latin America without really understanding what was happening in Spain in the 16th and early 17th century, culturally and musically. The forms that we're going to take over to the New World were already established there. The African influences were already there. The contributions of the early age of conquest in Spain already, in New Spain, already made it to Spain. And so we have the dance influences of Chacona and Sarabanda. And you can see it especially in the guitar music of people like Santiago de Murcia, these African dances like the cumbes, really growing a multicultural Spanish music that was very, very different from the usual dichotomy of nationalist styles that we address in 17th century music. That is the battle between the French style and the Italian style. And we will have Italian elements in New World music as a cultural force, but ultimately there's so much coming from this really unique Spanish style. So Spain had a dramatic form akin to Italian opera, zarzuela, that was completely unique, a completely unique form of stage entertainment. Spain had a form called the villancico, which was a sacred and sometimes secular music, a genre of equivalent to the cantata, but a completely different form. In this case, a chorus and these coplas, these verses. And what you see in 17th century and 18th century New Spain and in the New World is the battle between the Italian new influence that's coming over, the cantata, and the old Spanish forms, the villancico, the tonada, the tono humano, the really completely unique and different Spanish musical forms that were formed during this period of relative isolation and nationalism that happened in Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries. Let's stop for a second before we really talk about issues of composers of color. Are there any questions that anybody wants to lob out before we go any further?
I think we can move forward, Henry.
All right. One of the trends that we really need to address head on in 16th and 17th century Spanish music is the development of the negrito or the negrillo, which was, again, a Spanish event, not something that happened only in the New World. And this was music in dialect, written by white Spanish composers that was supposed to imitate the manner of speech of African immigrants. In fact, there were poets that gave instructions on how to affect this Guineo dialect. One of the most noticeable being the replacement of the R, the rhotic sound, with an L. So words like primo became plimo. Words, the name Francisco became Flancisco. Estrella for estrella. So this type of dialect was used to make fun of the way that Africans spoke. And this, you can see these pieces in the music of composers like Orlando di Lasso, which not only did he use the African dialects, but he also used Greek, Grigeski, the Greek and Mediterranean dialects as well. And really, it was the 15th, 16th, and 17th century equivalent of the minstrel song. This was musical blackface. And if we look at quite a bit of music that was written in the New World, this genre was imported there and it lived in the Latin American communities. There is a good deal of music written by mixed race and African composers coming from South America. This is not it. And so if you come across this music, we really have to be able to, number one, look at it right in the face and say, this is not okay. This is not music that we, a bunch of people that look like me, can put on stage without really being able to dig into the context and presenting this music in context. And I'm speaking from firsthand experience because I have performed with groups where they have done negritos on stage with an all-white cast. And the issue of dialect was not addressed. I mean, this is like Stephen Foster. This is like minstrel songs. This is something we cannot do at face value anymore. And so being able to look at it, being able to see these pieces in dialect that they call Guineo, being able to identify them for what they are, we need to be able to take this and say, all right, this is not okay anymore. We have a long way to go. This is one of the low-hanging fruit. Another problem we have is images of Native Americans in South American repertoire. There are dialogues between Indians that are just extremely racist, really show the colonialist views that these are less than human, that Black people, that Native people somehow don't deserve the same treatment, don't have the same humanity. And this is a type of music that we really can't be putting on stage anymore. This is something we have done. We've done this without context, and we need to be very conscious of the fact that this is happening. The good side to being able to look at this repertoire is that this music was not written for only people in a certain context. This is music that now belongs, like all good music, to all of us. It was performed and written by people of all races and colors, and it needs to be addressed and put on the stage, performed by people of all races and colors. We can no longer live with the idea that it's okay to be putting on performances of music from multicultural countries and cultures on an all-white stage. It should make us uncomfortable for good reason, and that's something that I think we need to really come face to face with. And as we move forward, I think this spring of 2020, where these issues have been thrown in our face with such force, we can come out of this a more diverse, we can come out of this a better artistic movement, saying that we acknowledge that this music was written by people of all colors and races. We need to be performing this music with people of all colors and races. We need to hire these people. We need to have them running our organizations and being part of our organizations. This is where we are, and this is where we need to go. And it's the job of everybody in this business to make that happen. My small contribution today is to point out some composers, some resources that we can use to make this happen, very practical tools that we can use to really diversify not only our repertoire, but also come face to face, shine some light on the colonialist context in which this music came from, and change the way we perform it. The major part of this discussion, I think, needs to be about transmission, preservation, and access. Right? This is a rediscovery in progress. We have resources that list composers of color. There need to be a lot more of those, and the document that I'm going to share today will actually give you a number of not only interesting composers and repertoire, but also specific resources. Where can I find this music? Where does it live? Where is it kept? How can we get there? And also just a little bit of the story behind this rediscovery process, which really started to pick up steam in the mid-20th century. Composers and performers have so much now with online resources they did not have even 10, 20 years ago when I was just beginning to discover this repertoire. Let me see, I believe I sent you that link, and that's not it in the chat box. Please forgive me, I fix harpsichords. My technological limitations will be on display for all to see. But I will give you a link to the PDF documents that I will be posting that not only give you a bibliography about where this music can be found, but how you can access it online. Before the advent of the internet, you had to go to the archives, the cathedral archives in many of these countries, the mission archives that often had manuscripts that were in really decrepit condition. And some of the pioneers, like Robert Morel Stevenson, like Piotr Nawrot in Bolivia, that went to these archives and actually transcribed this music from paper that was really falling apart. We are really indebted to that generation of pioneers here. And then we're also, the next step, indebted to people like Billy Traylor, like Salome Sandoval and Larry Gutierrez, Rick Savino, Drew Davies, Nell Snydus, these people that have taken this repertoire and really brought it out there, put it on the stage and made it accessible. This is where we are right now. We just have to ask the questions of where can I find this stuff and how can I use it? And so I will be sharing those resources as well. Just a couple of images that I'd like to share on the screen before we go any further, and wish me luck that this works. One of the most interesting resources that I've come across is a codex from Trujillo in Peru that really showed a number of images of everyday life in this city. This was dedicated to the Queen of Spain, and it was sent to the Old World. That really gives you an idea of how life was in the colonial times in this fairly decent sized city in Peru. Extensive pictures of costumes and people, and look at the skin tones of some of these folks. There's an index at the back of this codex that gives you, that tells you exactly what you're seeing in each of these pictures. But we have white people, brown people, black people, mixed race, people of all walks of life living together in Peruvian society. And again, in Lima, by the turn of the 18th century, there were over 100,000 people of African descent, both slave and free. Africans were brought over to work in the mines. This was a mineral-rich part. South America, mineral resources was so much a part of its immense wealth that was being extracted by the colonial powers. But you will see in these pictures that people of all colors made music. They were using not only imported instruments from Africa, such as the marimba, such as these idiophones, but also Baroque and Western instruments that are still very much a part of South American music of all social classes. And this codex also contained, it's one of the most important sources of dance music from different cultures that were coming together in Peru. One of the most interesting sources, there's a lot of sacred music out there, there's cathedral music, there's mission music, but this gives you an idea of a little bit of the music that was a little closer to the individuals on the street and in the cities, the music that was really sharing and building community. Now, getting to the music itself, and this is really what I want to shut up about and share. This is a list of some of the most important and most often recorded, most often performed composers, most often associated with colonial music from Latin America. Juan de Araujo lived in Bolivia for most of his life. He was a prolific composer of negritos, of that music in African dialect. One of the earliest composers of in the Pueblo Cathedral in Mexico, Pedro Bermudez. One of the most successful and widely distributed composers from Peru, Roque Cerruti. Down the list, Hernando Franco, that worked in about 5 different countries in Central and South America, traveling from cathedral to cathedral in the 16th century. Third from the bottom, Ignacio de Jerusalem. He was my first introduction to Latin American music. He was on the Chanticleer Mexican Baroque recording that really turned me on to some of this repertoire from the first time. Torrejonin Velasco, the Peruvian composer who wrote La Púrpura de la Rosa, the first opera that we know of from South America. Domenico Zeppeli, the composer whose music was known all over the continent. It was preserved, a lot of it, in these small mission archives in eastern Bolivia of the Chiquito and Moco Indians. It was also ordered by the Viceroy of Peru. I mean, this guy's music was everywhere. One thing every single person on this list has in common: they were all white. They were all born in Europe. And even though they all spent large parts of their careers in the New World, these were all European composers. Among them, a number of very important teachers that taught some of the native and mixed race composers that we're going to talk about for most of this. But ultimately, here's the thing. These were all white men making their living in the New World. and they're often the most performed and most identified with Latin American music. We're going to change that. I'm going to just briefly go through some of these names, and then we can talk about access a little bit. But this list is no means complete. This is composers that I've had firsthand knowledge working through their music and through their repertoires, and this is only a beginning. Some of these composers, although they were born in the New World, some of them are from mixed race. We know that they are mixed African, Native, European race, and I'm really giving them the benefit of the doubt. I don't know how many of these people were just extremely tan from 100% European backgrounds. That is less of an issue with the fact that these were actually spending their lives working in the New World, and most of them we do have actually references that they were mixed race. So there might be a stray all European composer in there, but my intent was really to keep that to an absolute minimum. In Bolivia, the only anonymous reference I give here were the number of native composers that were mixed into the missions of the Mojos and Chiquitos Indians that were part of this large Jesuit presence in eastern Bolivia. We have a lot of music by Zeppeli. We have a lot of music by named European composers, a lot of Neapolitan Jesuit composers and people associated with Naples, which was under Spanish control at that time. And oftentimes the Jesuits from Italy would actually travel down to Naples and then to Spain before they crossed the Atlantic. So you have this Neapolitan Spanish influence. A lot of galant music, Neapolitan galant music, ended up in these Indian archives. Most of it is unattributed, and we're really grateful to the work of Piotr Nawrot, member of the Society of Vincent de Paul, a Catholic priest, who was the first to really catalog and identify a lot of this music out there. There's still a lot of anonymous music out there. Some of it has been proven to be by European composers, but these composers were training native musicians. There was a lot of teaching going on, a lot of interaction of European and native musicians and music making, and so we do believe that a number of works from these archives were actually written by native composers. The next three, Chavarria, Andres Flores, and Blas Tardio de Guzman, were all Creole, mixed race composers that studied with Juan de Araujo. And they were really of that first generation of native composers to become maestros de capilla at cathedrals in Bolivia and really write music that blended native and European styles. A later generation, Manuel de Mesa, composer who was also mixed race and served that next generation in La Plata, which is now called Sucre in Bolivia. And the National Archive in Bolivia is a real resource with so many scores that are slowly being preserved and digitized. But Bernardo Allari, who's a musicologist, he's now at University of North Texas, wrote his dissertation on music in Bolivia, and he has been producing a number of pieces in modern edition by these composers, which it's very good music, very fine music as well from Bolivia. In Brazil, you have the country in which we have the most known African and mixed race African composers coming out of the 17th and 18th century. Africans were first brought to Brazil to work the sugarcane plantations. There were a number of free Africans as well working in Brazil. One of Brazil's most famous composers of the 18th century and early 19th century, Jose Mauricio Núñez Garcia, was the grandson of a mixed-race grandson of plantation slaves. And in the state of Minas Gerais, in fact, Black people were so prevalent in the music industry that they were, in fact, at sometimes the majority of musicians working in the state of Minas Gerais. So some of the folks that we really should be knowing more about, Domingos Caldas Barbosa, composer of both sacred and secular music, actually traveled to the Old World to study and died in Portugal. He was the composer of the first known Brazilian treatise on music theory. Joaquin Manuel de Câmara, a blind guitarist who worked in Rio, and his music was come across by an Austrian composer at the time named Sigismund Neukomm, who transcribed his modinhas, these secular love songs, and though by Neukomm's work, we actually know of Joaquin Manuel's music. Delightful pieces, beautiful songs, just such incredible gift for melody. Check out these, again, I will send a link to this document. Check out some of these composers. You'll be glad you did. Another great name in sacred music, native of Minas Gerais, is Jose Joaquin Lobo de Mesquita. His music for Holy Week especially, just stunning, stunning stuff. Native influence, there are just some wonderful folk harmonic progressions in his music, and also just a gift for classical melody as well. We have one known mixed race composer out of Colombia, Jose de Cascante. Quite a bit of his stuff survives in the Bogota Cathedral Archive. Some of those scores have been digitized and are available on the interwebs as well. One of the biggest names in Central and South American music is Esteban Salas, the first known native Cuban composer to hold the position of Maestro de Capilla at the cathedral in Santiago de Cuba, Cuba's second largest city. From Salas's early biography, it was inferred that he was mixed race, but Miriam Escudero, who edited his complete works and is one of the real gems of resource on Salas's works, does not, I have not come across a confirmation of that. In any case, two things going for Salas that I really recommend him for anybody interested in this repertoire. Number one, he was a damn fine composer. Number two, he was, like I think some of us on this webinar will admit, a complete early music geek. He was obsessed with the music of Tomás de Luis de Vitoria, the Spanish composer from a century past or more. And he transcribed Vitoria's works. He arranged them. And in fact, some pieces attributed to Salas were actually just his copies of music by Vitoria. He loved the Renaissance, and he incorporated that style very much into his works as well. So a composer that was both very much at home with the classical idiom at the end of the 18th century, but also able to write in the stile antico, that pseudo-Renaissance style that was still in favor in a lot of church music. Beautiful use, especially of violins and recorders. He has a requiem scored for 2 sopranos, alto, and tenor, 2 violins, 2 recorders, and continuo. And his requiem, it's about a 15-minute piece. It's about 25 minutes if you intersperse some motets. Such music of light. It's radiant. It's just, it radiates peace and love. It's a lot less dies irae and a lot more lux perpetua. It's a piece that I recommend to you. There are some really nice recordings of the piece out there as well. In Guatemala, in addition to a few interesting composers from the country, we also have one of the most important sources of music from not only the New World, but the Old World as well. The cathedral in Guatemala, Guatemala City, which used to be called Antigua, and I believe it was moved a little bit, but the cathedral there has an incredible archive of music that dates back not only to 17th and 18th century music from the New World, but is also one of the most important preserved sources of a number of Old World Spanish composers, including Sebastián Durón, some of the most important composers of the Middle Baroque in Spain itself. Somebody really had an obsessive compulsive preservation gene out there, because we have such beautiful copied music from such a wide number of composers. Unfortunately, the tropical weather has really done a number on it. The paper's in really bad shape. The archive has been digitized. It's all on microfilm. And one of the most difficult issues working with a lot of those sources is just legibility, is trying to figure out exactly what's on the page. And a number of musicologists have been working on these sources. It's an incredible amount of music. I mean, it is just such an important source. One of the most largest single collections of music in the New World. The composers working in Guatemala that often have quite a bit of music preserved there. Also an evidence of a really strong teaching tradition there. Manuel de Quiros and his brother Francisco. Manuel was a chapel master at Antigua Cathedral, and his nephew and his student, Rafael de Castellanos, was also one of the most important composers of the next generation, died in the same year that Mozart did. Between this nephew and the uncle, there's a whole circle of composers that were really just beginning to discover the range of sacred music that they produced as well. Moving to Mexico, the first person on this list, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, we only have one piece of music attributed to her. However, her poetry was so well known on both sides of the Atlantic. She was called the 10th Muse, or the Phoenix of Mexico, this woman of letters, an early feminist, a theologian, just a badass composer and poet. Her poetry, her villancicos, to Spain, and from Spain, they made their way back to other countries in Latin America, so much so that we have so many composers setting her music, sometimes playing with it a little bit. The piece was addressed to Virgin Mary. They changed the words and address it to Jesus. But her poetry makes up a very significant body of sacred music from Mexico and beyond. I included her in this list because it's definitely somebody whose works we should be more familiar with if we are not already. Juan de Llenas, one of the early 17th century maestros de capilla of the cathedral in Mexico City, a mixed race composer. His music is actually preserved in a convent archive, the Convento de Carmen, that was adjoining the cathedral. And it's through the works of Juan de Llenas that we know that there was quite a bit of music making in the Spanish convents and also the convents in the New World. When we think of nun composers, we often think of the Italians. But there was quite a bit of music making going on in the New World convents. Unfortunately, it's the preservation issue. We don't have a lot of scores, and I'm hoping that as more work is done in some of these archives, that some of the music was moved around, that we can hopefully find some more female composers in addition to, and just knowing that the music happened in the convents. Antonio de Salazar, the composer of one of the most famous negritos that's most widely performed, Tarara, yo son Antonio, again in the dialect, the black dialect called Guineo. Gregorio de Soberanis, we know almost nothing about this person. His music is preserved in Guatemala City, and the most interesting thing about him is that what we know about him comes from the Guatemalan composer Manuel Quiros, who arranged his music and thought so highly of it that he actually copied it out and transcribed it and added parts. It's beautiful writing. It's very Vivaldian, a composer that we should know. And if anybody's interested, I will send you links to my email where I have made some modern editions of his music as well. And the most prolific and one of the most important composers of native Mexican composers of music coming out of that middle Baroque period, Manuel de Sumaya, also one of the two composers featured on that very groundbreaking Chanticleer Mexican Baroque recording. There are quite a bit of facsimiles available online, but also Aurelio Telo did some very important work in getting these pieces out in modern edition. I'll give you some internet resources where you can actually see this music. The good thing about Sumaya is he wrote not only very large-scale cathedral music, but also devotional works for a much smaller scale. A lot of these composers that I list, we have this duality. We have music for double, triple choirs, large orchestras, but also there's a good deal of smaller works for one or two singers with a small instrumental ensemble. It's accessible, it's beautiful music, it's fun to perform. It has that wonderful blend of Spanish rhythms and Italian melodism. Sumaya is somebody definitely to look up. The name that I mentioned earlier in the list of immigrant composers, Ignacio de Jerusalem, was a really interesting case, because although he was so important to Mexican music, what he did was he said, no, we are not going to perform these Spanish musical forms. We are going to be Italian. We are going to do Italian cantatas, and we are going to use the Italian musical form of da capo arias and recitatives, and so he really pushed back against the more Spanish and native influences during his time. Sumaya, not so much. It's a beautiful Spanish flavor and mixed with folk music, mixed with some beautiful melodies. Somebody I highly encourage you to explore. One known mixed race composer from Peru, and again, known, there are more, and we have to keep the research coming. And again, it's just, this is a topic that we can delve into for quite some time and only scratch the surface. Jose de Orejon, also small cantatas, beautiful sacred music as well. A couple of important names from Venezuela. Francisco Perez Camacho, the first known really important chapel master in Caracas. His music is a little hard to find. There are sources. Juan Manuel Olivares, the first, in fact, a couple of musicologists called him the earliest known Venezuelan composer, and that's not the case at all. But what he did, what we do have from him is the first known truly instrumental music, a duo for 2 violins. The first known Venezuelan purely instrumental music. Again, I will make this whole list available to you for download. This is a bibliography that just scratches the surface of a lot of the work that has been done over the past 50 or so years, making this music accessible in modern edition. Also, there are a lot of places where you can find the music, the manuscripts online. Wonderful resource by Ramiro Albino that lists by country a lot of the maestros de capillas of the different cathedrals. It's a really great resource to be able to see what's out there and give you some inspiration, saying, well, we need to go and actually look for more music here, because there's a lot that has not been really given its due, has not really been brought to the surface. That's our job. The Guatemala Archive has been digitized. Those are all of the manuscripts. Some of them are incomplete. It's a slog to get through some of that music, but it's really worth it. And a number of people have been already working on that. I've mentioned some of them earlier, and this is just my exhortation for you to find interesting music and transcribe it yourself, get it out there, get it performed. Mexico has some great resources. INBA, the Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes, has digitized the Tesoro de la Música Polifónica series. So much of composers like Sumaya, like López Capillas, like Juan de Llenos, these mixed race composers that were really some of the great pioneers of Mexican music. A lot of that is available online. The Brazilian resources, and again, this is really important, because in Brazil is where we find the largest concentration of musicians from an African background, mixed race African composers and immigrant African composers. Música Brasilis is a great resource online. You can find not only scores, but really interesting biographical information about some of these composers. It's in Portuguese. So if you don't speak Portuguese, I suggest you get that Google Translate working for you. Or even better, talk to somebody who speaks Portuguese. Build some connections. Build bridges to people who are actually from those traditions, and get them involved in your music making if you haven't done so already. These partnerships, this is really the future of where I'd like to see early music going. This is not about people like me being the only people who are doing this. There are people from all different cultures, races. There's so much musicology going on in South America right now. Festivals in Bolivia, in Cuba, festivals going on that celebrate the musical heritage of these countries and the composers that are native there. It's something that I'm really enjoying getting to know on a larger basis, and with my work in Seattle, just bringing this music to the stage. The next big goal here is to really make it known that this music lives, this music is out there, and it can be a part of your program. It can be a part of your next concert. Composers of color, performers of color can be part of your next concert. That's what we're trying to do here. I will make a link available to all of this information right now and open it up for questions. I'm done talking.
Thank you, Harry. That was such an enlightening panel. Thank you so much for such a comprehensive list. This is going to be so useful for so many of us, performers, researchers, educators alike. And thank you for such a powerful call to action and such a powerful call to connect as a community and combine our efforts, because like you say, there are many people who are researching this very important topic and there needs to be change in the field. So thank you for that. There are a few questions from the chat box and from the Q&A. There is, from earlier in your panel, someone asked what the approximate date of the codex was that you showed on your slide.
And, 1680s, I believe.
And then someone asked the title of the Peruvian Codex that you showed, and if there are any facsimile available.
Yeah, the facsimile is available online. I will actually put a link to a copy of that facsimile right in the chat. What I'm uploading to chat right now is the document that I was just referring, with the list of composers, bibliography, and also list of European composers that I was talking about earlier. All of that is now uploaded, and now I'm going to send a link next to the codex that I was speaking of earlier as well.
Fantastic. There's also a question, is there any music that you've encountered from Chile?
Yes, there is. It's a little late to the party. We're talking about later 18th century music. José de Campoderos is one of the most important composers from that period of time. Well, thank you, Olman Alfaro, that Fernandez was found to be actually born in Guatemala. Okay, that's interesting, because yeah, I was under the impression that he was from Edora or somewhere out there in Portugal, but that's good to know. And Trujillo is early 18th century. It's called Codex Martínez Compañón, and I'm going to actually put a link to that right now on there for the whole document. And again, this information is so, there is so much out there. There are so many composers that are being rediscovered. I saw one question about music in Panama. That's something where I know that Hernando Franco went through there, I believe, in the 17th century, but I don't have that information off the top of my head. There was music in the cathedral in Puerto Rico. There were composers in so many corners, so many cities and towns going on. So much of it has been lost, but so much of it is being rediscovered. So.
There's a few more questions that have popped up in our Q&A box. Some really incredible questions. I hope we have a chance to cover them all. If not, like we said at the beginning of the panel, we'll have a roundtable following this session. One of our questions in the Q&A is, as a performer, what elements should musicians adjust when they want to present this repertoire in a historically informed manner? Do you have any thoughts?
You know, I was trying to look at another question. Can you please repeat that for my?
Oh, sure, no problem. As a performer, what elements should musicians adjust when they want to present this repertoire in a historically informed manner?
Well, there are issues of cultural performance and there are issues of musical performance. On the musical side, just think about the language. Think about the difference between Spanish and New World Spanish and issues of Brazilian Portuguese versus Portuguese. But mainly I'm concerned with the issues of cultural sensitivity. Don't perform negritos with an all-white ensemble. I don't, don't perform anything with an all-white ensemble if you can help it, right? But I think this music, when there was a lot of Latin American Baroque music that was written for a liturgical context, it's liturgical music. It was performed either with respect to that or in context that it was designed for. A lot of it is not very idiomatic to either the New World or to mixed race composers. That's the same thing that goes for a lot of Black composers from the United States. There's a lot of music by Black composers that is not is not idiomatically Black per se, but it's art music. It's great music written by Black composers. William Grant Still is one of my all-time favorites. He's like Beethoven in a sense that no matter what he writes, it sounds like William Grant Still. And he walks the line between jazz and classical music and African-American traditions and European classical music. It's so much about context. You know, are we being genuine to the context? And that's the most important thing. Perform the music, give it the context that it needs. Say that this music was written in a colonialist context, in a colonialist society, a multicultural society, but one that's not necessarily just. I think the more information, the more that you give to your audience about how this music was received then and what it means now, in context of the fact that we're actually waking up and realizing that early music is pretty darn racist. We need to be able to, that I think is more important than any specific issues of historical performance. We can address those as musicians.
Thank you, Henry. Just reading through the questions, I don't think we have time for all of them, but it seems like there is a very strong interest in modern editions of a lot of this music to make it more accessible, especially at collegiate level, at community music schools with diverse enrollment. You mentioned some of these music has already been edited. Will we have access to some of these links, perhaps on the Early Music America page?
Yes, for sure. I will just chime in and say we will add all of this to the new resources page that we've created. I linked it earlier in the conversation. I'll relink this here. It's the new resources for diversity in early music repertoire. We will, of course, incorporate this. We'll also post a link to this video for anyone to be able to go back through that. So yes, that will be included on the website. And we did have someone ask a question about if you were attending this video, if you were watching via Zoom, we'll send an email to everyone who registered for the meeting with links to these resources as well as the on-demand video afterwards. So yes.
Fantastic. I think we have a couple minutes, so I'll pick one really interesting question here. Could you speak more about the influence of African rhythms on ground basses, Chacona, for example? Where could we find more about this topic? And along with that, I think another question is how much of this music is not sacred or liturgical?
Okay, the last question first, because that's the easiest to answer. Very little. In Brazil, the Modinha repertoire, these secular love songs, there's quite a bit out there. That's one place to start. And again, that's a place where we have a lot of Black and mixed race composers that were writing this material. That's one place to start. There's very little purely instrumental music from this repertoire. In fact, there is a source of instrumental sonatas from the Mexico City Cathedral Archive. I believe the actual manuscript went missing. But it's been digitized, and it has a bunch of Corelli sonatas that were solo violin sonatas, and then a bunch of anonymous sonata movements, and those were treated as anonymous for a long time. However, it was just found that those were actually the work of a Neapolitan composer, and I have a link to that paper that actually that actually discusses that. But to get to the African rhythm question, just something that I see, Lowry Gutierrez. Hi, Lowry, if you're still out there posting. She says what is crucial is that people keep missing the African music and instruments component to this music, and how important it is to pay attention to the African influence there. Yes, my favorite recordings of this music really take into account the organological blending of repertoire as well. We are much more aware of the evolution of European instruments into South American and Central American folk instruments, and how the Spanish harp has really kept its form, and how the Baroque guitar has evolved into some of these instruments like the cuatro and the charanga, and what we're much less aware of, and that's probably because of racism, is that African influence, and how important it is to really be able to work with African musicians who know these traditions, and South American and Central American musicians that know these traditions, to be able to make a product that's not whitewashed. We don't know all of the performance context of this music, and some of this music, especially the sacred music, that's a cappella, that really works in a cathedral setting, this polychoral cathedral setting. That's pretty easy to put on and make it sound like European music. But especially when we get the dances going, and there is so much dance in here. And again, this is true of music from Old Spain as well as New Spain. A lot of the African influence is much more important than we give it credit for. And I think some of the worst performances I've heard of this repertoire is trying to make it sound like Corelli, or trying to make it sound like Haydn. When you put that African influence back in, it makes all the difference.
Thank you, Henry. I think this is all the time we have. Those questions that were not addressed, we can address in the roundtable at our next meeting immediately following this. And I just want to...
I'm sorry, I set the meeting to start at 2:20 to give us time to get up and get a drink.
That is 4:20 Eastern time.
Yes, thank you.
And I just want to thank you, Henry. This has been so enlightening. It is incredible, all the research and the time that you have put into this, the passion that you have for this subject, and to have such a comprehensive list that's representative of the true criollo, mestizo culture in Latin American Baroque. This is so essential for moving forward in our mission to diversify our field. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone in attendance. And I'll pass it over to David.
And yeah, once again, thank you so much, Maria, for helping today, and Henry for your presentation. And thank you everyone who has joined for this record-breaking attendance for one of our webinars, and we really appreciate it. And tying into this, in addition to the resources for repertoire diversity that I mentioned before, is an upcoming webinar that you may be of interest in. It's less of a webinar and more of a roundtable meeting discussion that's coming up next Wednesday, a week from Wednesday, I should say, July the 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern time, 11 a.m. Pacific time in the U.S. And we'll be having Gus Dennard from Early Music Seattle and Dr. Monica Rojas Stewart, who will be talking about building partnerships that advance justice. And they'll talk a little bit about the work that they've done to build these kind of partnerships to promote repertoire diversity, to promote understanding through musical organizations. And I'm going to post here in the chat a link to the registration. That is a free registration. It is a meeting. We have a limited participation because of the roundtable nature of that. So if you'd like to participate, I recommend registering as soon as possible. You can also find out about upcoming interest sessions on our website, as well as other webinars. We have a series of webinars coming up in July that you may be interested. You can also find out about more of the resources promoted through the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Task Force, of which Maria is a member. on our website, and there are links to resources there and news articles and more as that organization, as that task force continues to create more resources for our website, and there's a link in the chat to that as well. So many things to keep us thinking, and it is our thought here at Early Music America that we will continue this conversation. This is a wonderful introduction to the repertoire, and we hope to be able to focus on some of these areas that Henry brought up today and go into more detail with other specialists, and we're looking forward to that. And so do watch our website and subscribe for our newsletter, and watch Facebook and all of those other channels that we have to make sure that you find out when the next things are coming. So thank you all once again. About 15 minutes, the roundtable will convene on Zoom in a more informal manner, and we invite you to join that if you're able to do that. So thank you once again. This will be archived on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page for you to watch however you like. And we will also include links to all of the resources that were mentioned today. So for Early Music America, I'm David Wood, Special Projects Manager, and I hope you'll join us next time.